about it.
Maybe it's deliberate.
Yeah, maybe it's just stop people saying thank you. Okay, we are now live. So hi everyone, welcome to the latest in our lunch hour series. And today we're going to be reflecting on European security after the NATO summit with our all-star panel comprising of Sophia Besch, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment based in Washington, D.C., Georgina Wright, Special Advisor and Senior Fellow of the German Marshall Fund, who is based here in London, and Natalie Tocci, who is Director of the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. Welcome, all three of you. Thank you for doing this. Let me kick you off with my normal sort of softball starter. If I was to say to you what your main couple of reflections on the state of European security now, what would you say? And Sophia, I'm picking on you.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. The state of European security is a very broad question. I'll maybe say a couple of things about that, and then I might zero in on the NATO summit and what we've just seen there. I would say that the state of European security, we have moved from a shock to a realization that things have to change. We have moved from a very abstract and academic and theoretic debate about strategic autonomy and European pillars to a much more practical acknowledgement that Europeans have to do more, quote unquote, for their defense. But with that acknowledgement has also come a very practical reckoning of all the gaps that are still there, whether that's in the capabilities, the strategic enablers, the ammunition, but also, I think, crucially in the strategic coherence and leadership realm. We have much more defense spending, and follow the money is usually a pretty good phrase to follow when you want to tell if countries are serious. We have some of the important countries like Germany spending a lot more money, but of course we know that actually just spending more won't solve all our problems. It's not just about the quantity, but the quality of the spend. And here's where we get into the strategic coherence bit. What do I mean by that? I mean that we still don't have a Europe-wide sense of what we're defending, what we're willing to give up to defend it, both territorially and conceptually. And we saw that, I think, at the NATO summit. I mean, the NATO summit was a success if you buy into the very low expectations that were set for it by the European leaders ahead of the summit, which was just to prevent President Trump from walking out. In reality, I think what we've seen is a strategic shrinkage with European leaders who have accepted the 5-4-5 logic of Washington, D.C., so spending 5% for Article 5 commitment. I think that was a mistake because that is not how Europe feels what NATO is about. We have seen European leaders willing to give up any discussion of Russia, of Ukraine, of China, any substantive strategic discussions at the summit, just for the price of keeping the US in. And we can drill into what that means in detail, but I really think that we see after the summit a Europe that is still much too focused on the keeping the US in part of NATO and not enough on the keeping Russia down part of NATO. Or keeping Russia out, the Germans down, it's no longer really a thing. But
Well,
I
you
think,
say that.
yeah.
Georgie?
Well, thank you very much, Anand, and to the UK and Change Europe for the invitation. Sort of found myself nodding very profusely at what Sophia was saying because I'm sort of on the same. I mean, I think exactly the same. What we're seeing in Europe is definitely a move from saying we need to do more to actually thinking about what we can do more. And I know that the NATO summit, there was a lot of criticisms that European didn't actually present a coherent plan on how they're going to progressively replace or the United States, or at least rebalance the role that the United States has played in European security. But we know that behind the scenes, those conversations are happening, they're real, and it's everything from sort of intelligence to critical enablers and stuff like that. So there does feel, if you look at the glass half full, it does feel like we've moved away from saying we want to do more to actually doing more. The question really is how we spend that money. So we know, for example, that if you look at the EU's own kind of conversation on how you can accelerate and improve defence procurement. It's basically those conversations have been gridlocked for the past 18 months because member states can't agree on whether EU money should go to support any defence projects that have components from non-EU member states. And so you still feel that sometimes we're kind of stuck when it comes to the nitty-gritty to conversations we were having pre-war in Ukraine, pre-Trump. So there are still some things that need to be clarified. And that's where perhaps my caution would come in is I feel like we are moving, but we're not moving fast enough. And of course, the question really remains on how we're going to win the public over, because you can commit to 5%, you can say, by 2035, but there have been, if you look at Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, he says that Russia could be able to attack a NATO ally in the next, 3 to 5 years. So how is 2035 a really credible deadline? Should we be thinking to bring that deadline forward, and then how do we win the public over? And Spain was kind of the naughty ally at the NATO summit, but in a way Sanchez said out loud what many other leaders don't want to say out loud, which is actually it's really difficult for us to convince our publics that we do need to increase defence spending because it would mean less money elsewhere. So we need to win the public over. We need to figure out how we're going to spend the money and what are the sort of short-term priorities and then the medium to long-term priorities. And then amidst all of that, how we're going to continue to support Ukraine. And I think part of that is going to require a conversation of how we integrate Ukraine's defence industry into the European-wide defence industrial base. But there are, of course, Ukraine has needs, and we're going to have to try and fill those as well. So there are going to be difficult decisions down the line, but I'm going to be on the sort of slightly cautiously optimistic start.
Natalie.
A little more beat, certainly than Georgina, but possibly closer to Sophia. So, I mean, it seems to me that last week's summit was a diplomatic success that risks masking a massive political failure. Yes, it's true that nothing went dramatically wrong. And of course, when Trump is around, there are all sorts of ways in which that can happen. So there are no pullout of troops from NATO, no explicit killing of Article 5, no throwing Zelensky under the bus. So that, diplomatic tick there. Diplomatic tick in getting that defense spending target, 3.5%, 1.5%. We know that 3.5 in any case more or less amounts to, on average, what needs to be spent in order to meet NATO's capability target. And also, I mean, probably least likely of all, the diplomatic success of at least having a mention of Russia in the final communique, which wasn't at all to be taken for granted. So, I mean, certainly kudos for the diplomats that were hard at work on this summit. I worry, as I say, that all this risks masking a political failure. What I mean by this, or a substantive failure, what I mean by this is, fine, we're now all happy and we pat ourselves on the back that the US is kind of still in, and yet there is a US defense posture review going on. And let's say I'd be very surprised if that were to, when that is eventually revealed, if that doesn't actually announce some rather unexpected changes. I mean, we know and we expect that there may well be a sort of partial withdrawal of US forces in Europe, but we're kind of all happy and confident that this is going to be partial, gradual, and coordinated. And that seems to be, I mean, hopefully it will turn out to be correct, but a somewhat optimistic assumption to make. And I think it's an assumption that we tend to make more since the NATO summit, because, as I said, nothing went dramatically wrong. I also think that, again, behind the, patting ourselves on the back that at least we get to mention that Russia is a long-term threat to Euro-Atlantic security, we forget the fact that NATO doesn't have a Russia strategy, and it doesn't have a Russia strategy because although it was agreed to agree on it last year, given that we have Trump in the White House, the agreement was to actually shelve that process. And then I think the third aspect, which worries me a lot, is the underlying the success, the diplomatic success of the 5%. We, on the one hand, are setting ourselves up for a next decade of kind of frustrations and kind of recriminations, because many of these countries will actually never meet the 5% goal. I fear that this will actually lead not only to a transatlantic rupture, which in any case is not caused by the 5%, but is caused by, all sorts of other things, beginning with Donald Trump. But I fear that this is actually going to lead to divisions within Europe. Given that, at least in principle, with the exception of Spain, everyone has signed up to the pledge, but no one will actually, or hardly anyone will actually meet it. And this kind of brings me to Sanchez. And of course, I agree that on one level, indeed, Sanchez was the naughty boy. But on the other hand, in a sense, he was the only one that had, and I think Georgina was saying this, the intellectual honesty. I'm not sure he did it for intellectual honesty, but that doesn't really matter. But the intellectual honesty to say and to call a spade, which kind of brings me to my final point, which is if all of this is aimed, as I think it is aimed, at deterring Russia, and if we kind of take a step back and we think, so what exactly is Russia's strategy? As it tries to, in a sense, reconstitute empire in Europe, it certainly has a military and a hybrid strategy in Ukraine and sort of looking northwards, so Poland, Baltics. It has a mainly hybrid and political strategy looking south and particularly west. And what I mean by a political strategy is one which is mainly focused on disinformation and election meddling. And this kind of, it both affects those countries to the south, which Russia wants to have in its sphere of influence, some of which, of course, it already has, like Hungary, Slovakia. But moving further to the west, what you want to have is nice, cuddly, pliant governments, right? And the way to do it is to ensure that you have nice, cuddly, populist parties which actually enter government. Which is why, coming back to the Sanchez point, I ask myself, is it more in the Euro-Atlantic security interest to have a Sanchez or anyone who is, at the end of the day, committed to European values, to transatlantic security and all the rest of it, that spends 2%? Or is it more of a security threat that Sanchez is kind of, bullied into whatever, paying 5%, end up having Vox in power that ends up siding with Russia? So I think, as we think of the Russia threat, which is why actually it would help to have a Russia strategy in NATO, that as we think of the Russia threat, I think we really have to disentangle the military, the security, and the broader political threat, acknowledging that actually it's on the security and political bit that actually Russia has been far more effective than on the military side of its strategy. And I fear that a sort of 5% that has been put out there to keep Trump happy will end up paradoxically making Putin even happier.
Interesting. Do we think that Russia is an immediate territorial threat to NATO Europe? I mean, I get the impression that Russia might have bitten off more than it can chew already.
Well, I mean, and yes and no, I think, in the sense that no, if you think of it in terms of, can Russia actually pose, is there a realistic prospect that it conquers Lithuania, right? Probably not. Does it therefore mean that it will, that we can say with any degree of certainty that therefore it will not try? And I would say, well, definitely we can't say it, right? Because one would have thought that after 3.5 years of kind of trying to occupy Ukraine, Russia could have come to the conclusion that maybe it's unoccupiable, but it doesn't seem to have reached that conclusion. And so that's why I do think we need to take that military threat credibly, even if we don't see capabilities capable of achieving their intent.
Okay. And I suppose the other really important moving part is the United States. And I suppose this is a question for any of you who signals that they want to answer it, which is what sort of, I know it's an impossible question, but it strikes me as a really important question to get our heads around if we're going to plan, is what kind of United States are we planning for? A United States, I was on a thing with Natalie a few weeks ago where she put it really, really well. I mean, you know, it's sort of a staged, gradual, small-scale withdrawal versus essentially betrayal, I think was the word you used, Natalie. And there's a long spectrum there of potential outcomes in terms of US policy, and what we expect the US to become is going to have a massive impact on what we're preparing for and what we're spending this money on and what assets we're needing to build up. How should Europe deal with that? And I mean, Sophia, I mean, I'm going to go to you, Sophia, because you're based in DC, so I therefore reckon you've got an inside knowledge. Where does American policy go from here when it comes to Europe and European security?
Yeah, I mean, let me first admire the problem with you before trying to solve it, because I do think that I think we disagree in Europe over where we think US policy is going, foreign policy going vis-a-vis NATO. Everybody is trying to figure this out. We can see it in real time here in DC with Europeans taking meetings. And honestly, it sort of depends which institution, which ministry, which secretary you go to, and you'll come back with a different message. Often you come back with a message that is much more optimistic on the record than what these people tell us when the European officials are not there. And so I think this contributes to a fairly mismatched picture. I don't think that the US course is clear yet. We have a president who doesn't hugely care, honestly. We saw this at the NATO summit. He cares at the surface level of political quick wins, which he got with the 5%. He likes the flattery of European leaders. He likes the one-on-ones with a couple of them. So I think, as Natalie has said, diplomatically, Europeans have understood how to play this president. One level below, this president presides over a government that has different foreign policy strains within it. And most relevant for Europe are those who think that the United States should withdraw from the world because of the fiscal overstretch and the power overstretch of a declining empire, and those who think that the United States should pivot to Asia, for now as a catch-all phrase. And that it matters for Europe because the kind of resources that the US might withdraw from Europe in the force posture review, for instance, the ground forces, those are not resources that are particularly important in the Indo-Pacific, right? The United States doesn't need to move all these ground forces to Asia. They could leave them in Europe if they accept that they want to have that large of a presence in Europe. If they go with those who argue that we need huge cuts to the US military, huge cuts to the US military budget, then Europe will be one of the first priority where we will see cuts. And I don't think that that fight has been fought yet. I think there are a couple of moving parts. One is obviously the Middle East. And Middle East contingency really affects Europe-US force posturing in terms of CENTCOM and the kind of troops that you then again need in the European theater. Taiwan is a question that is still very much being fought over here, and the budgetary questions are too. And so the force posture review is going to be a first indication, and it's obviously unfortunate that this administration does not care to align with NATO planning timelines. It would have been really useful to have a force posture review before the NATO summit, and so that NATO defense capability targets can respond to the presence that the US plans or not, because as Natalie has said, the 3.5% are derived from NATO regional plans. This is a very real target. We can sort of scoff at the 5%, but the 3.5, most countries are not going to get there. But actually, I'm a bit more optimistic on the financial side of this, because the fact that all countries get there matters for unity purposes, but really what matters is that the big economic leaders get there, and the fact that Germany is actually committing and has given itself the fiscal space to get there is going to make a huge difference to the European rearmament process, much more than whether Spain spends that money or not, frankly. The UK and France are the more difficult actors here. They would also really make a difference, and they do not seem to want to have that guns versus butter debate that comes with that. But, you know, had we had the force posture review, that would have been nice. Even when the force posture review comes, I think at a minimum level, I would expect that we go back to pre-2022 US forces in Europe. So those are the rotational forces that were put in after the full invasion of Crimea, of Ukraine. It could go beyond that, it might not. The problem with this administration is that even then, I'm not sure that the fight is fought and Europeans can sustainably plan with that. This is going to be an ongoing political discussion here in the United States that might be brought up again and again when it is politically convenient to the main players in this government. And so Europeans, I think, are right to try and not provoke big moves there from the United States. They're right to try and attempt to make this a phased retreat, a responsible retreat, a staged retreat, whatever you want to call it. But they have to prepare for the fact that it might not be. And even once the force posture review is out, I don't think we can lean back.
But above and beyond this administration, and obviously there are particular uncertainties about this administration because everyone seems to say something different, particularly, as you said, depending on who they're talking to and who you're talking to. Should Europe prepare for a world in which basically it is ensuring its own security in 20 years' time? Georgie, do you think? I'll come back to you, Sophia.
I mean, Sophia's, is at the heart of it, and so we'll have things to add. I mean, I sort of agree with everything that you hear, is that the administration, when it talks about Europe and particularly the US's role in European security, is pretty drastic on we're going to, leave altogether or progressively leave. But actually behind closed doors, they're much more constructive on what that means. But as Sophia said, it can depend a little bit on the whim of the president and also on the politics. And I think this is really important to understand how Europe is seen in Washington, in the administration and beyond. There really is a bipartisan consensus that Europeans have been free riding for way too long. And when I was in Washington and saw Sophia, I think one of the things that I was really struck by is that you don't only hear, oh, they're free riding, they should do more, but it's also the point of actually they're just an annoyance. They just sap all our time. Like every day you've got all the EU ambassadors and you've got multiple delegations that come through and want to see us and want to make the case and say, yeah, we know we need to do more. We agree with you on that. We know we need to do more on the Indo-Pacific, but actually can we just keep everything as it is in our country? And I think they're really tired of that. So there's also the sense that we're just simply annoying. And so actually I think that's why our diplomatic, how we've been changing our diplomacy and our approach to Washington is really necessary, and there are signs that it is working. But I think now we need to move to the next stage, which is a real transition plan, and amongst Europeans think about what a transition plan would look like with less US in European security, and completely plan for the possibility that the US might not be here in 20 years' time. I mean, I don't think that's anyone's hope, but we should plan for the worst and sort of hope for the best. And I think, we at German Marshall Fund published a roadmap on how we could rebalance the transatlantic security and defense and trade partnership in particular over the next 5 years. And we're sort of calling on a transition plan for a 2030 burden shifting thing, where you'd see basically Europeans responsible for 70% of the political leadership, primary responsibility responsibility for conventional defense, and then the US retaining its nuclear umbrella supported by a conventional footprint, and then some of the strategic critical enablers that Europeans cannot replace in the short term. So that's sort of intelligence, long range precision, strike, the sort of all the stuff around air to air, lifting, refueling, and all of those things. So I think that we're quite clear amongst Europeans what are those. I'm really sorry about these Teams noise that I cannot seem to take off. I hope you can't hear them. But anyway, so I think we're very clear on those strategic critical enablers that we cannot replace in the short term. But I think we are all clear also that we need to take on greater political leadership and actually step up our conventional defense. So I think that's something we can do. Maybe we can come back to France, because Sophia's right. I think Germany has really stepped up. France says it will step up, but I have great sort of, I'm quite skeptical about whether they can meet some of their defense commitments, but perhaps we can come back to that because that matters as well.
We will come back to France, but I'm obviously more glass half empty than any of you. Even when I was young, we were aware of the strategic enablers we needed, and it seems to me from memory they were exactly the same ones that we're talking about now, and this is 20 years ago. So I'm kind of wondering what sounds to me like your relative optimism comes from. Go on, Sophia.
Well, okay, so European defense was not designed to be independent, right? European defense was designed to plug in to US armed forces through NATO. We had a sort of opt-in model where we never really tried to be independent. There was this debate, as you say, for a long time of what it would take to theoretically get there, to do burden sharing better. I think the mental shift that needs to happen is to move from better burden sharing to keep the US in, to burden shifting in order to deter and defend against Russia. And some countries are there and some countries are not there. And I think that's why you can have a glass half full and glass half empty view of this, depending on which capital you speak to, what budget you look at, whether you're more in the north or the east, or whether you're more in Germany, or whether you're more in the west. And the problem is that we are going to have to find some sort of a coherent narrative that works for all of Europe. The coalescing objective of the past few years has been the defense of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And we are now moving, and I mentioned this earlier, into what I think is a much more problematic coalescing objective of trying to keep the US engaged. And we're losing countries in the process of that. This sort of readiness versus rearmament, the thing of what to call the EU's programs, that has become a bit of a punchline, but I think it goes to a very real problem, which is that there is no European strategic agreement on, if the US is not there, what should be our ambition? What should we try to be able to defend? Is Ukraine, frankly, is the border of Europe at the outside of Ukraine, or is Ukraine on the outside? I don't think we have a real agreement on that in Europe without the United States. And that is the strategic debate that has to happen. And that is why it's, the NATO summit, at the very least, has become a completely marginal affair to European defense. And we had an EU summit coming right after the European summit, where I would have hoped for more of this conversation to happen. But again, I think mostly what we saw there was, well, it's going to be really hard to hit those funding targets. And we're still not getting to the point of having a real debate in Europe of what an indigenous European defense needs to look like, beyond just trying to replace like for like what the US is currently doing. And I think Natalie had it very right that the consequence of that is real European division going forward.
I can just jump on this. So I think everyone obviously would agree that having a US that remains at least partly attached, and and the extent to which it disengages, it does so in a gradual and coordinated way. Everyone agrees on with that. The question is, what should we be assuming in order for that to happen? And I think that's where the division really kicks in, because there are some that think that actually the way to keep the US in beyond the kind of slightly, cringe flattery is, it is basically not to do certain things, right? Because if you do, then you're totally independent. And then obviously Trump has the perfect excuse to turn his back. And that there are others that, and I certainly would put myself in that second category, that would actually assume that you have to assume betrayal in order to get indifference, or even benign indifference. And I think that's really where the division is. And because it's very clear that the minute in which you assume that you can somehow maintain, US critical enablers in Europe, invest in certain things. I mean, there's a reason Anand has seen that list over and over again for God knows how many, not even years, decades, right? And so we will continue not investing in these things, especially given that actually increased defense spending at national level is not going to do the trick in this respect. Because it's clear that if we actually want to move forward on some of these things, the air defense, the long range capabilities, etc., these require multinational projects, which 150 billion in SAFE is obviously not going to be sufficient in order to incentivize this. And so, yes, you're going to have this increased defense spending, and it means that we're going to be more capable, but not necessarily more capable in terms of having the things that we actually miss. And so I think that so long as, and I think, Sophia, you put it really, really effectively there, if we now change the focus from what do we need to do to contrast Russia into a debate about how do we need to keep the US involved, then we're really setting ourselves up for a catastrophic failure. But the problem is, where is it that we have that Russia conversation? Because we obviously can't have it in NATO, right? In fact, we can't really have it in the EU either, because you've got, what I call the reverse Vance threat, the enemy from within. So where exactly are we talking about the reason why we're doing all of this in the first place? Because the fact, as I said, the fact that we can't talk about the real thing means that we end up talking about the US, which means that we end up in these divisions.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the sort of institutional thing. What I want to do is talk a little bit about defense spending and what that means. And then we'll come to some of the member states and we will talk about, we can't do this hour without talking about institutions for a little bit. But first, on the defense spending, we've had a question in which, you talk, Sophia, about Europeans confronting the guns versus butter challenge. And it's an interesting question that says, does it have to be a guns versus butter challenge? Because certainly in the UK, and I don't know how convincing you find this line, the argument now is that this is a sort of neo-Keynesian push for growth. Defense spending doesn't mean difficult trade-offs. Defense spending is a route towards growth. Now, I personally am not 100% convinced by this, but I wonder what you think, Sophia.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I've written about this a little bit. I think that it's a very tempting way to frame defense spending as a growth motor. It's really convenient to integrate it in the overall competitiveness debate, because that is the one thing that you can say in Europe right now that everybody will agree with. But just true, we do need to increase our competitiveness. And there are aspects of course, if you invest in defense R&D, that has trickle-down effects, and you are creating jobs. You see in Germany the shift from the automotive industry to the defense industry, with defense industry literally hiring automotive workers and taking over old factories, and very symbolic sort of shift from one legacy industry to another, with the caveat that all of that actually takes much longer than it looks like on the headlines, because you have to recertify and retrain all of these people. I don't think that economic growth is the reason to spend money on defense. I think that I think that people are going to see through that. I think we have to make a much better case for, there are lots of good reasons to spend money on defense. And we have to keep trying to make that case rather than sort of telling people to look over there at that shiny thing over there, because you are going to have to, with the kind of numbers that we're talking about now, 3.5%, this is a huge amount of money for the big economies. I mean, for Germany, spending 3.5% means that Germany is going to be the third biggest defense spender in the world after China and the United States, right? Bigger than Russia currently, multiple times bigger than what the UK is spending. This is a huge amount of money. Germany has, through its constitutional debt brake change, given itself some fiscal space. I think if the UK, and Georgie and then Anand and Natalie, you have a better sense of it, but if the UK wants to spend even 2.5% of its GDP on defense, there are going to have to be cuts and possibly tax increases. We see a couple of countries where this is already happening. In the Baltic states, for instance, you do see countries having to increase taxes and cut social spending in order to pull through the kind of defense spending increases that they're doing. And the reason that my sense is there's not a big public uproar against this, revolt against this, is that the population buys into why we need to increase defense spending to this degree. And this sort of brings me back to the point that I made at the outset, which is, and that I keep making, which is that if I'm trying to convince my public why we need to increase defense spending, I think because Donald Trump needs to have something shiny to give to his base is not enough of a reason. And I think that a 3.5 or 5% is not good enough of a target to present to your people either. You have to be able to say very concretely, which the Baltic states are able to say very concretely, Russia is at the border, here's why we're spending this. That kind of narrative won't work for Spain, right? That kind of narrative barely works for Germany. I think what you can tell your people there is that if we don't do this, the EU might fall apart. If we don't do this, the European project might no longer work, because solidarity is at the heart of the European project, and then our markets might fall apart, and there's a real trickle-down effect from that. But then you also have to be able to tell them that this money is going to a good place, and this money is not being wasted. And we're not just spending this money at a national level, all of us, because we can't come together, we can't agree to cooperate and integrate our forces because it's just too difficult. So we're going to waste huge amounts of money to have those flashy, shiny targets. I don't think that that is going to work. So you're going to have a good narrative, and you're going to have to be able to show your people that you're spending much more efficiently than you're currently spending. And we're far from that right now.
Okay, Natalie, did you have your, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is super, super important. I mean, look, defense can have an economic upside, but defense is for defense. And so defense is for defense. And if you can't make a credible case to the public as to what you need to defend yourself against, you are either going to shove it down their throats, and it could work for a while, but most likely what you will end up having is a massive backlash as a result. I mean, just think of the analogy, which was actually, there was a much stronger case for an economic upside to the energy transition, right? You end up kind of framing the green transition as a growth strategy. Exactly the same thing was done, right? Kind of painting, obviously, also this wonderful green world as a result, but in kind of downplaying some of the difficult things that would have to be done in the process of getting there. And of course, the minute in which you have some of these kind of redistributive effects kind of hitting you in the face, you end up having a massive green lash, and then you completely drop the entire objective. And it's not a coincidence that Russia has benefited from this in the same way as it will benefit from the political backlash from defense. So actually, my bottom line on this is that ultimately, inevitably, you're going to be able, geography matters, you're going to be able to make a better case in some countries than in others. In those countries where you can't make a very good case on defense, strictly speaking defense, you can maybe push it a little bit by saying some of the things that Sophia was mentioning really also trying to instill some sort of sense of solidarity. Okay, fine, you may not have Russian tanks rolling into Rome, but it's kind of a problem if no one gives a damn if they might roll into Lithuania, right? So, I think solidarity is also something, there's something to be said for that. But inevitably, Poland's going to spend more than Italy, right? And maybe we should just come to terms with that. And it's better, as I said, as Spain. Italy's a bad example because we already have a far-right government. But let's go back to Spain or even Portugal, right? It's better to have a solid pro-European, pro-Atlantic government that spends less, as opposed to one that ends up spending just as much and gets kicked out, and you end up having pro-Russian, pro-MAGA, whatever, forces in Portugal and Spain. I mean, it's not as if our countries are immune to this threat, right? And it's a much graver threat, graver security threat than the immediate military threat from Russia.
Georgie, will you?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what was said. I think it's almost like we need tailor-made, PA campaigns about why increased defence spending makes sense, because and I hope everyone has been listening to Sophia and Natalie from different EU governments. If they're not, they should be, because you made some really important points. But I look at Macron and Le Cornu, who's France's defence minister. He's survived the number of governments that have fallen these past years. They've been making that case repeatedly, right? European solidarity, the fact that actually more defence spending will generate, more money for kind of manufacturing, for French industry. That means more jobs. That means, like, they've been pushing those arguments, and still there are raging debates on whether this is the right thing to do. So I think it's going to really require every country to think critically about what sells, because I'm not sure that those arguments always work everywhere. And then if you look at the case of France in particular, I mean, pre-NATO summit, France in its own national defence plan had committed to increasing its defence spending to 20 billion by 2030. And everyone was saying there is no way that they're going to manage that by 2030. Why? Because, debt is currently 114% of GDP. Economic growth is not great. And so basically there are 4 ways that France can meet that target. That's cutting spending elsewhere. Well, that's really unpopular, especially as we got a presidential election in 2027, and parties are moving on that. You can increase taxes. That's also very unpopular. You can rely on massive economic growth. Well, that's not proven to be really working these past couple of years. Or you can try and mutualize debt at the EU level, and I suspect that France will be pushing that more and more in the run up to 2027 for sort of more EU money, or another sort of big mutual debt plan to somehow support defence spending. And so I just think that actually, even if it shouldn't come down to guns versus butter, it does in the end come back to that.
It's almost worse than that, isn't it? Because that argument that we're going to spend a lot more on defence and we're going to spend it here is part of the problem, isn't it? Because actually, if Europeans are going to do this well, we have to spend a lot more on defence and face the fact that we might be giving it to one of the other member states if we want to do this efficiently and effectively. So
can I quickly because I think Denmark has taken over the rotating EU presidency today, actually, and Denmark is like a remarkable case for how much their thinking has changed over the past couple of years since the war in Ukraine. So they obviously now joined, kind of fully fledged behind Europe doing more for its own security, reversing years and years of Danish kind of policy on that. They've also done a sort of 360 on industrial spending on an industrial policy, and how much you're going to spend on, in particularly in Europe. And actually, if you listen to their kind of government position, it's very much a Europe-wide approach. So it's not just we're going to spend in Denmark, we're going to spend everywhere, because it increases European overall defence spending, European defence production, and also this does mean that actually it's not just limited to Denmark. So there are cases of countries that are capable of articulating that, of doing that really well. And I suspect that Denmark, now holding the presidency, is going to do a big push on all of these issues. So I think it is possible. It's just, of course, as Natalie said and Sophia said as well, we do come back to some of the political constraints at home, and we don't always have governments in power that are sort of wedded, even if they are wedded publicly, that behind closed doors they're not so sure about the increased defence spending. And also you've got parliaments and parties that have huge sway in power who are sort of against this altogether. So it's a battle on many fronts, I think.
I mean, how confident are you that should the money appear, which is the first thing, it will be spent well? And what if anything, can institutions like the EU do to try and nudge member states into doing things more effectively, avoiding fragmentation, duplication? I mean, I often get the impression in Europe that defence spending is a bit like social and employment spending via other means. That is to say, we stick it in stuff that keeps people in jobs without really thinking about the military outcomes. Is there a way of doing this better that you can foresee? Natalie, you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there's no, I mean, there are all sorts of bits and bobs that you can do, but at the end of the day, money is what is going to be driving this, right? I mean, if you look at sort of, how the money is spent, 90% on average, of national defense budget, especially in those countries that have a defense industry, right?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, if you don't have it, you don't have it. But those who do spend 90% on their national industries, and 10% on that, the rest of the 10%, or maybe, 8%, they spend on US, maybe 2% on other kind of whatever European. So long as most of the money in that increased defense spending is going to come from the national level, I really struggle to see how it will, be spent differently from how it has always been spent. And so this is why ultimately you can only really hope to change this by adding those financial incentives at EU level. But, as I said, that 150 billion in SAFE is peanuts compared to the 4 trillion that will be spent. And so at the moment, we're not headed towards spending in a more integrated way because the financial incentives are simply not there.
Sophia, do you want
to... Sorry, just again, given that I was, earlier I was giving the green example, I mean, just by way, again, of comparison, this is a moment which has a level of gravity which in many respects is infinitely higher compared to COVID. We managed to summon 800 billion for Next Generation EU. And what are we doing now? 150 billion in loans? I mean, is this really what the EU does to rise to the moment, right? So, but this comes back to the political problem. Yeah, the reason why we're being so pathetic now, as opposed to, I mean, we weren't fantastic before, but we were slightly better before, is because now we have an increasing number of far right or wannabe far right governments that are resistant towards doing more at EU level.
Sophia, were you about to come in?
Yeah. So we've very elegantly moved into the institutions part of this conversation, and then so I'll maybe build a little bit on what Natalie has said. I think that we are moving out of a very precious academic conversation around how you could best structure European defense industrial cooperation with the EU or through NATO or intergovernmental coalitions to something that is a lot messier and a lot closer to reality, right? It's always going to be a patchwork. You're always going to have, even in an ideal scenario, you're going to have some intergovernmental coalitions that center around, for instance, the JEF in an operational way, or that center around a particular capability like missiles. You're going to have some of this defense planning that ideally keeps happening at NATO, because there's a lot of tradition and institutional knowledge and expertise at NATO that I personally would not want to give up. So that's going to continue to keep happening there. And then there's something that the EU can contribute as a sort of defense industrial motor hub through financial incentives. And I'm very much with Natalie. I think we have drastically lowered the ambitions of the EU in that realm. Basically, what the EU has done this year is got out of the way of member states and really kicked the ball back to member states. And I think that is, if you're looking at it from the sort of national defense ministry perspective, that makes sense, and you might think that you can do it. But then it is going to be much more expensive, and it is not going to create that sort of European narrative that we keep talking about. Yeah. I think right now the EU is basically the one institution that has taken itself almost out of the running. There's some things that it might be able to do going forward with the European Defence Industry Programme, EDIP. That is sort of the thing that I'm watching right now. That's the successor to the European Defence Fund. That is not just loans, it's grants. Grants can have a much bigger, can make a much bigger difference here than loans, I think. And if in the EU financial framework negotiations, member states were to decide to allocate a lot of money to EDIP, then that would make, I think, a real difference. I'm not betting on it, but I'm watching it.
I mean, the EU hasn't stepped out of the way when it comes to procurement, has it? I mean, the EU stepped into the game when it's come to procurement, it strikes me. I mean, we can get onto the sort of more operational stuff at the moment, but my impression is that the EU is sort of leading the way when it comes to talking multinational sort of capability development, isn't it? Am I being naive?
Leading the way on talking about it.
Right.
I mean, I think there is a lot the EU can do on procurement. It is already doing that in the space realm, and certainly on some of the big strategic enablers, which, by the way, just because it's become a bit of a pet peeve, you can rattle off a very long list of strategic enablers. Really important right now in the Ukraine context are the ones that enable us to do air defense better and defend our skies better. So really it's the C2 and ISR and missile defense, integrated missile defense, that we need to focus on. So the EU could do much more there. I don't think that we have seen the concrete steps yet that would lead me to think that member states accept the EU stepping into this realm. The problem is it's always the sort of chicken and the egg thing. The EU still hasn't managed to prove its added value in this realm to member states. It still hasn't managed to show that if you go through the EU, it's going to be cheaper and it's going to be faster. Because so far, most programs, even the sort of trial balloon programs that went through the EDA, have not been cheaper and faster. They've maybe been more expensive and taken a bit longer, but that's also because the money wasn't there in the right sums yet. It was a trial program, so at some point you're going to have to trust the EU with taking this forward. And currently, member states don't trust the Commission and they don't trust each other.
Is that true of the new German government, do you think? I mean, it does strike me that you could make a difference if Chancellor Merz says we're spending all this money and you know what, we're going to spend a lot of it through this multinational framework, and sort of sets an example. Is that at all likely, do you think?
The serious answer is I don't know yet. I don't want to speculate. I think I can tell you the things that you know, which is that Merz definitely has European instincts. He believes in European defense integration to a certain extent. He has understood the risks of the US withdrawing. At the same time, the German defense ministry is not better than any of the other defense ministries, and they also do not really want to let go of national control over their armament process, over their procurement process, and over their R&D processes. So I think the impulse would have to come from very high up. It would have to come from Merz, and we don't know yet whether he's going to push them there.
Okay. We should probably spare a little thought for the UK, that I think probably finds itself in a far lonelier position than it thought it would be in 2016, now in the world as it is. And I suppose one of the questions that preoccupies here is the degree to which these EU schemes are going to be open to non-members, and how one deals then with the issue of the UK being outside the European Union, but an important security partner. Is there any sense that the EU is open to working very, very closely with the UK? I mean, last I'd heard, there was a debate going on about how you structure some of these programs like SAFE. And I just wondered if any of you had a sense of how those debates were going, and whether or not, given the strategic imperative, there was a sign that there was a move towards greater openness on the EU side. Natalie? And I'll get you next, Georgie. You were slightly behind her.
And there is openness. I mean, actually, I think the UK is less lonely now than it was maybe only a year ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all relative. Um, so yes, I do think that there's greater openness. I think, obviously the sort of the nitty-gritty of the regulation will still need to be determined. But I think as a point of principle, third countries that have security and defense partnerships can participate in the program. And so I think this will actually happen. What I worry about is, firstly, what I was saying earlier, i.e. that actually was, in the big scheme of things, was talking about a very limited pot of money. And secondly, and this comes back to the Trump part of the conversation, that if part of the genuflection also includes a willingness to include the United States as a third country, and there have been some that have been pushing in this direction, then the UK gets crowded out, but not because it's the UK and because there's in principle a closure to third-party access, but rather because there's too much third-party access, and basically the US ends up gobbling up all that space.
Okay, Georgie, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Natalie just said. It strikes me that a few years back, it was very much a Brexit, thing, which is like, you've left the club, you can't get the same access. You've got to understand that you're a third country. And of course, some member states pushing even strongly about that. Now we're much more in a space where actually the war in Ukraine has brought the UK and EU much closer together. If you're thinking about European-wide security and defence, it does not make sense to compartmentalise between EU member states and non-EU member states. But there is the question of precedent, and that's always been the case in the EU context, right? You've got a group of 27 countries who don't trust each other, so you have processes, you have ways of doing things, and it's exactly the same about how much access you grant to your market, to your projects, to your funds, to third countries. And can you justify granting the UK access but not the United States or not South Korea, and other big non-EU defence players and defence industrial bases? So I think there are conversations ongoing about that, and also because some member states would quite like the US defence market to continue having access, and for the EU to include the US in its third country preference, because they think that might improve relations with Washington on a whole sway of things, guarantee long-term US role in European security, also that it might in some way reduce the heat on the trade war. So there are lots of different elements to this. I do think the UK has undoubtedly played a huge role in the war in Ukraine, and I think every EU country recognises that. I do think there are worries across Europe about how credible the UK's defence spending is long term, and also in terms of sort of how you're going to actually spend that money. And there's lots of confusion. It's probably the same for a lot of other countries, but it is something that I hear quite a lot when I travel around Europe. Is yes, of course, the UK has important political leadership, but can it meet what it says? With actual capabilities and more defence spending, and there is, I think, scepticism on that point.
Sophia.
I'm a bit less happy with the progress on the UK-EU cooperation side than Natalie and Georgie, I think. I think, of course, we started at a very low point, but seeing how much trust, how much political goodwill, how much practical cooperation was established throughout working with each other on Ukraine, I think the actual UK-EU defense agreement, defense pact, is pretty thin. It doesn't really have a lot in terms of concrete deliverables and concrete commitments. That basically is a lot of agreeing to talk more. Compared to some of the bilateral conversations that the UK is having with Germany on Trinity, with France on renewing Lancaster, with Poland, with Italy. I think there are a lot more sort of tangible objectives in there, especially cooperation on key systems objectives. So to me, that is a missed opportunity on the side of the EU also, which continues to, I think, treat the UK as a partner like other partners, like South Korea, like Japan, for instance, which I think is a mistake. I think there needs to be a special cherry for the UK, especially in the defense industrial realm. Otherwise, we're really cutting off our nose to spite our face. And then just a final point on the US. This is one of the interesting developments that goes to what we were saying earlier about there being different priorities and viewpoints in this administration, with Secretary Rubio really pursuing a sort of traditional US stance of lobbying for the involvement of defense firms, US defense firms in EU initiatives, which obviously goes against the sort of more strategic autonomy minded restrainers here in the administration. And I think it's a fight that for now the defense lobby here in the US is winning, and Europeans are really going to have to think about whether they want to strengthen their spine against that lobbying effort, seeing at the same time that transatlantic defense industrial cooperation is not going to go away. No side wants that to go away. There are a lot of capability projects that both sides are deeply embedded in, and there's no point in giving them up, I think, especially with the administration changing its rhetoric on Russia a little bit and supporting Europeans' support of Ukraine. But on the EU access, I think Europeans might want to consider whether what they're getting out of that still justifies the ends. So whether there are still security guarantees attached to that access or not.
Okay, we've reached that awful situation where we've got less than a minute left, and I'm always regretting ending early, but on the other hand, I don't want to keep you after the promised endpoint of 2 o'clock. So I think we might call it a day there. I've got a list of about 10 more questions, which means I'm afraid that we're going to invite you back to do this again in the autumn, if that's okay. But for the moment, it's really, really nice to see the three of you. Thank you ever so much for doing this. Have a very, very good summer.
You do.
And we will see you again in the autumn. So take care, all of you. And thanks to all of you for watching.